Good morning. Welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit, and today I wanted to go through a chapter or two from GTO Gems with you. This is our brand new book co-written between myself and Coach Weasel, and essentially what we aim to do is take our years and years of solver exploration and break them down into actionable insights for you, so that way you don't have to spend the same number of hours solving and analyzing solver output. Rather, you just kind of take what we've learned from it, give you the major gems that we found through this kind of explorations. That way you can improve your overall strategy and figure out where GTO works for you and where maybe you just ignore GTO and focus more on the exploitative side of the spectrum. So if you've already purchased your copy of GTO Gems, awesome, just lay back and enjoy the audio version of these chapters. Or if you haven't bought your version yet, you can always do so today, redchippoker.com/gems, or search for GTO Poker Gems on Amazon to get the Kindle or the paperback. Your choice, whatever works best for you. And with all that said, let's dive right into the first chapter of GTO Gems, and time permitting, maybe we'll get the first two chapters. Let's get started. Gem number 1. There is a solution to poker. From the earliest days of poker, there were players who recognized that the game had an element of skill. But why did some players seem to win so consistently? Were they simply the luckiest players on the planet? We can now prove beyond reasonable doubt that, although poker has elements of short-term luck, in the long term it is a game of pure skill. Over a sufficiently large sample of hands, a skilled poker player will always win when playing against weaker opposition. Like many other games of skill, poker has an optimal solution. This means that there are objectively right and wrong answers to the tough decisions we face at the poker tables. What is an optimal solution? When poker players talk about an optimal solution, they mean something very specific. They are referring to a mathematically perfect game theory optimal, or GTO, solution. The definition of game theory optimal, or GTO. Game theory is a branch of mathematics that deals with calculating strategies for competitive situations, such as playing poker or other strategy games. If a poker decision is game theory optimal, it means it is mathematically the best possible decision when facing a perfect opponent. When a poker player follows a perfect GTO strategy, it is impossible for them to be beaten. The absolute worst case scenario is that they will break even when facing an advanced opponent who is also using a GTO strategy. Against unskilled opposition, a perfect GTO strategy will make significant profits. Sounds good, right? We're guaranteed to either win or tie against everyone we play against. So how exactly do we get started with playing perfect GTO poker? The GTO solution to poker. Let us start with the bad news. The complete GTO solution to popular poker variants like No Limit Hold'em and PLO is not known at this time. Further, no such solution is anticipated in the foreseeable future. The number of different possible actions, boards, hands, and bet sizes in these variants is so vast that it would take an unrealistic amount of time to generate a complete GTO solution. Put another way, the game tree, which includes all possible actions, boards, hands, and bet sizing, is too large to allow a full GTO solution to be generated, even using powerful modern computers. The good news is that we can still make extremely good estimates of what GTO poker looks like by making use of a simplified game tree. Imagine a heads-up poker game where players have limited options. For example, perhaps they are only allowed to bet half-pot, check, or call at every decision point. The GTO solution to such a game is now simple enough that any amateur with a basic laptop can calculate the full solution using GTO poker software. Solvers. GTO poker software. There is now commercially available software that provides the game theory optimal solution for a given game tree. These tools are referred to as solvers or GTO solvers by the poker community. Note that solvers do not provide a full GTO solution to poker as we've just discussed. They provide a GTO solution for a given but simplified game tree. Almost every GTO solver will have an interface that allows the user to construct and configure their preferred game tree. You will not need a GTO solver in order to make use of this book. Our objective is to teach you valuable GTO poker concepts without the need for you to run complex solver analysis. However, you may prefer to purchase a commercial solver anyway if you're looking for a deeper dive into some of the concepts we discuss. If you're interested in using the same solver we use for our post-flop solves, coupled with a complete training course for using it correctly, please visit gtogems.com/solver. What do GTO solutions look like? There is a great irony behind the quest for the full GTO poker solution. Imagine for a moment that a futuristic space alien dropped the complete GTO solution to poker onto our desk. We're in for unforetold riches, right? Not exactly. The first problem we would run into is that our desk would likely collapse under the weight of several trillion pieces of paper. The full GTO solution to poker is huge, and please don't ask why the futuristic alien is using regular paper and not telepathy. Let us say, purely hypothetically, that we convinced our personal assistant to work a ridiculous amount of overtime and collate all of that information into an easy-to-access digital format. This is where we run into our second big problem. The GTO strategy is so complex that it is virtually impossible to execute correctly. But in what way is the strategy complex? It's just a case of making the decision to either call, fold, or raise at any given time, right? In detail, no. One lesson we learned from simplified game tree solves is that GTO Poker makes heavy use of mixed strategies. Definition of mixed strategy. A mixed strategy is one in which a certain poker hand is required to take differing actions at certain frequencies. For example, when facing a bet, GTO Poker might require a hand to call 70% of the time and raise 30% of the time. Note that when a hand instead takes a certain action with 100% frequency, for example, it always calls, this is usually referred to as a pure strategy. Rather than simply call or raise, imagine a hand that needs to raise 17.4% of the time, call 37.8% of the time, and fold 44.8% of the time. Imagine that these frequencies change with every hand that we're dealt on every street we play and against every single bet size we face. Humans simply do not have the mental capacity to track these types of complex frequencies over tens of thousands of hands. Alas, when we finally uncover the full solution to poker, only machines, or savants, will be able to accurately execute the solution. The relevance of GTO Poker. If playing GTO Poker is something that we can never realistically achieve, we might question why we should even bother exploring the world of GTO Poker at all. Put simply, we do not need to play perfect GTO Poker in order to win at poker. We just need to have a better understanding of the game than our average opponent. Exploring GTO concepts can dramatically improve the way we think about poker strategy, as well as allowing us to dominate the majority of our opponents. An important starting point is to appreciate the following statement. The goal of learning GTO Poker is not necessarily to play GTO Poker. The goal of learning GTO is mostly to get a better understanding of the mistakes our opponents are making and how we can exploit those mistakes. Exploiting our opponent's mistakes will be more profitable than rigidly adhering to a GTO style of poker. Why exactly is this the case? We can find the answer by analyzing a well-known game that has an extremely simple game tree. The game is usually known as rock, paper, scissors. GTO versus exploitative, RPS. It is highly likely that you already know how this game works, but assuming you've been living under a rock, yes, pun slightly intended, let us recap RPS briefly. Rock, paper, scissors is a two-person game in which each player chooses either rock, paper, or scissors without letting their opponent know their selection beforehand. Once both players reveal their selection, the scoring table is simply rock beats scissors, scissors beat paper, paper beats rock, and if both players choose the same item, the result is a tie. It just so happens that RPS is an example of a solved game. The game theory optimal strategy for RPS is to choose each option exactly 1/3 of the time. Using this strategy, we will always win exactly 1/3 of our games and tie 1/3 of our games in the long run. It does not matter how our opponent modifies their strategy. There is absolutely nothing our opponent can do to prevent us from winning exactly 1/3 of our games. The perfect GTO strategy for RPS ends up with neither player winning in the long run. The end result is a tie. Poker is similar. When two perfect GTO poker players play heads up, the result is that neither player will make a profit in the long run. Imagine our RPS opponent was not very experienced and decided to pick rock with 100% frequency. If we continued with our GTO RPS strategy, our long-term results would still be a tie. But is that our best strategic response in this situation? Ideally, we would switch to choosing paper every single round if we knew our opponent would continue to only pick rock. We would win 100% of our games this way. We would no longer be playing a game theory optimal strategy, but instead we will be implementing an exploitative strategy. Definition of exploitative. An exploitative strategy is not considered game theory optimal, but it is designed to take advantage of the mistakes that our opponent is making, where a mistake is any deviation our opponent makes from the perfect GTO play. Exploitative play in poker has the potential to win more money than a game theory optimal strategy. Knowledge of GTO poker is extremely valuable because it allows us to recognize when our opponents are making errors. Further, GTO strategies provide a baseline from which we deviate exploitatively. Keeping score in poker. In RPS, the winner is simply the person who wins the most rounds, since every round is valued the same. This is not true in poker. A player who wins more hands does not necessarily win the overall game, because different amounts of chips are wagered on each hand. The profitability of various decisions in poker is measured using expected value, or EV. This is a very important GTO poker concept that we will be using throughout this book. Did you know? Unlike the GTO strategy for RPS, GTO poker does not break even against everyone. Although GTO poker breaks even against another perfect GTO opponent, it will generate a positive win rate against opponents who are making strategic mistakes. The gems. While a complete GTO solution may exist for complex games like No Limit Hold'em and PLO, it will be impossible for a human to accurately implement. You do not need to play perfect GTO poker in order to win. Exploiting your opponent's mistakes will be more profitable than rigidly sticking to a GTO approach. Simple games, like RPS, offer a clear visualization for using versus deviating from a GTO solution. A player who wins more hands does not necessarily win the overall game, because different amounts of chips are wagered on each hand. Gem number 2. Unexploitable bluffing. Even before the days of GTO analysis, the best poker players intuitively understood that there was a limit to how much bluffing they could get away with. A well-timed bluff can undoubtedly be very lucrative, but if you start bluffing all of the time, even the most obtuse of opponents will catch on to the exploitation that is taking place. Conversely, if we are never bluffing, it becomes too easy for opponents to simply fold strong second-best hands when we do bet, recognizing that we almost always have an even stronger holding. The solution? Just like RPS, we need to mix up our lines. If we can build our betting ranges with a good balance of bluffs and value bets, it makes it much harder for our opponent to exploit us. A bluff is a bet made with a very weak hand that aims to get our opponent to fold. A value bet is a bet made with a strong hand, i.e. a value hand, that aims to get called by worse holdings. A perfect bluffing strategy. GTO analysis teaches us that there is a perfect balance between the number of bluffs and the number of value hands that we should bet in a given situation. This balance is referred to as the bluff-to-value ratio or bluff-to-value. Definition of bluff-to-value ratio. A bluff-to-value ratio describes the relative number of value hands and bluffs that we have in our range when we bet or raise. For example, a 1-to-2 bluff-to-value ratio means that we are bluffing half as often as we're value betting. Alternatively, we might say that 1/3 of our range consists of bluffs. Having the perfect bluff-to-value ratio not only makes it difficult for our opponent to play against us, it actually makes it completely impossible for an opponent to construct a winning counter strategy. A perfect bluff-to-value ratio is the equivalent of always choosing each option in RPS exactly 1/3 of the time. But what does the perfect bluff-to-value ratio look like? To understand this, we need to first lay some important groundwork. A simple GTO model. It is common to make some simplifications and assumptions when applying game theory to poker. We will be making use of the following common assumptions when discussing bluff-to-value ratios. Assumption 1. We are analyzing a river situation. The concept of bluff-to-value ratios applies mainly to river situations. The model we're about to discuss will not apply directly to earlier street scenarios. We will consider a heads-up situation where one player, the aggressor, makes a bet against their opponent, the defender, on the river. Assumption 2. The aggressor has a perfectly polarized range. The aggressor in this model has a betting range consisting purely of value hands and bluffs. That is, it's perfectly polarized. The value hands can never lose its showdown, and the bluffs can never win its showdown. The aggressor is first to act, aka out of position, on the river in this model. Assumption 3. The defender has a range of pure bluff catchers. In this model, none of the hands in the defender's range can ever beat the aggressor's value hands at showdown. However, all the hands in the defender's range will always win its showdown against the aggressor's bluffs. The defender is last to act, aka in position, on the river. The term bluff catcher refers to a hand that can only win if our opponent is bluffing. In the context of a GTO discussion, a bluff catcher will also be at least strong enough to beat all of our opponent's bluffs. This outline model, along with all of the assumptions, is sometimes referred to as the perfect polarization model. Take a moment to make sure you have a good understanding of this scenario, since it will crop up quite frequently in conversations about GTO poker. The perfect bluffing frequency. When making use of the perfect polarization model, the perfect bluff-to-value ratio is entirely dependent on the size of the aggressor's bet. The easiest way of calculating the perfect bluffing frequency for the aggressor is simply to consider the pot odds that the defender gets when facing a bet. Take a simple example where the aggressor bets $100 into a $100 pot on the river with a perfectly polarized range. How often should they be bluffing? Let us start by calculating the pot odds that the defender is getting. The defender would be risking $100 to win the $200 pot. They are therefore getting 33% pot odds on the call, or 2-to-1 if you prefer ratios. As the aggressor, we should bluff the same percentage as the pot odds the defender is being offered, 33% or 1/3 of the time in this situation. The remaining 2/3 of our betting range should be value hands. If we instead use ratios, we can say that our bluff to value ratio should be 1-to-2, which is simply the pot odds ratio switched around. It is therefore impossible for our opponent to exploit us if we play this way given the proposed situation. Of course, knowing the optimal bluffing frequency does not automatically mean we understand how or why it works. Let us take a look at that now. How does a perfect bluffing strategy actually work? Remember, in our example, that the defender holds a bluff catcher, which means that they will only win if the aggressor is bluffing. Think for a moment about the following questions. Should the defender call the river with their bluff catcher? On what factors is the decision dependent? The answer depends purely on the defender's pot odds. The defender can call profitably if they expect to win more often than their pot odds percentage. Let's break that down. If the aggressor is bluffing more than 1/3 of the time, the defender should always call because it will be plus EV, or profitable, for them to do so. The aggressor is bluffing too frequently according to game theory. If the aggressor is bluffing less than 1/3 of the time, the defender should always fold because calling will be negative EV, or unprofitable. The aggressor is not bluffing frequently enough according to game theory in that spot. However, if the aggressor bluffs at the perfect frequency, exactly 1/3 of the time, there is nothing that the defender can do to exploit the aggressor. It is only if the aggressor deviates from the optimal bluffing frequency that the defender is able to generate an exploitative counter strategy, in which the defender either always calls or always folds. The following table shows the 3 possible scenarios along with the implications of the defender's EV. Scenario 1, the aggressor bluffs more than 1/3 of the time with a pot size bet. The defender's EV, calling is plus EV, folding is 0 EV. The defender can maximize their win rate by always calling. Scenario 2, the aggressor bluffs exactly 1/3 of the time with a pot size bet. Calling in that case is 0 EV, and folding is 0 EV for the defender. The defender cannot change their win rate by adjusting their strategy at all. Scenario 3, the aggressor bluffs less than 1/3 of the time with a pot size bet. In this situation, for the defender, calling is negative EV, folding is still 0 EV. The defender can maximize the win rate by always folding. Attempting to counter. Let's play devil's advocate for a moment and try to increase the defender's EV by playing around with their strategy. We know that folding more will not help the defender, since the EV of folding will always be 0. Instead, consider the defender's EV when they call to see if you can increase their profits. There are 2 possible outcomes that can occur when the defender calls the river with a bluff catcher. The following is an example of how we calculate the EV of this simple poker situation. Scenario 1, the bluff catcher wins $200 because the aggressor is bluffing, right? They win the $100 pot plus the aggressor's $100 bet. This happens 1/3 of the time and wins $66.66 per hand in the long run. Scenario 2, the bluff catcher loses $100 because the aggressor is value betting and the defender is going to lose their $100 call. This happens 2/3 of the time and loses $66.66 per hand in the long run. Total EV is 0 EV, adding up those 2 numbers. The amount the defender wins when the aggressor is bluffing is perfectly balanced by the amount the defender loses when the aggressor is value betting. We have demonstrated that the expected EV of calling the river with a bluff catcher is exactly $0. Did you know? No matter what the defender does in this model, their EV will always be 0. Even if the defender always calls, always folds, or mixes up their calling and folding ranges arbitrarily, their EV will always be 0. We usually express this by saying the defender is indifferent between calling or folding with their bluff catchers. This is not to say that the defender's calling frequency is not important though. For example, if the defender chooses to fold every single time, this is something that the aggressor can potentially exploit. The gems. We should bet a mixture of bluffs and value hands on the river. This is known as a polarized range. The larger our river bet sizing, the more frequently we should be bluffing. Value bets should account for the larger portion of our range, even when using larger sizes. The GTO bluffing frequency for the aggressor is the same as the pot odds percentage being offered to the defender. Final advice. Avoid getting bogged down with the precise bluffing frequencies. Even being somewhere in the right ballpark with your bluff to value ratio will make you a lot tougher to play against. So I think that's a good stopping point for this podcast episode, and I really hope you enjoyed the first 2 chapters of GTO Gems. If you like what you're hearing so far, definitely make sure to get the full book today. It's available at redchippoker.com/gems, or again, search for GTO Poker Gems on Amazon to get the paperback or the Kindle if that's what you prefer. As always, thank you so much for hanging out today. I really hope you enjoyed, and if you want to see another chapter or so from GTO Gems, please don't hesitate to leave a comment, or of course you can always join our Discord and let us know in there, redchippoker.com/discord, to join for free and talk poker with over 3,000 poker players that love the game just as much as you do. Again, thanks so much for hanging out today. I'll see you back shortly with a brand new episode, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.